Welcome to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com. And if you've listened to the past couple of episodes, or if you've listened to some of the recent Free Talk Live episodes that I have been on, you know that there's a special announcement coming sometime during this show. And I can't give it away at the very beginning of the show. I've got to, give you some reason to stick around other than the fact that, you like hearing my insights and hearing some of the weird news that I bring up. Not that, what I bring up is necessarily weird, but I do, have weird insights on some of it. So I will definitely give the big major announcement at some point during the show, but I can't do it at the very beginning. And, of course, we all know that this is, about 5-6 days after that horrible thing that was called an election. And before I go on, I know that I voted and I wrote in none of the above for some offices. I committed an act of civil disobedience on Election Day, as did a bunch of other people in the state of New Hampshire, and it might have actually been successful at bringing about change. Of course, we won't know until sometime in the spring, but there was a bill that was introduced by one of the state reps earlier this year. It wound up going through and getting passed into law. It took effect September 1st, that makes it illegal to take a picture of a ballot and post it anywhere online through quote-unquote social media. Well, I took a picture of my ballot, a bunch of other people took pictures of their ballots, and two people that participated in this act of mass civil disobedience are actually state representatives who have said that they will introduce legislation to overturn what they call a quote-unquote silly bill. And I agree, it is rather ridiculous, and hopefully they are successful in getting that overturned. Nonetheless, I find elections, especially in the current way that they exist, to be a rather silly way of making decisions. Because in some places, and there were like 146 ballot measures on the ballot in, that's cumulative across the entire country, and some of these seem to be conflicting. And actually in Washington, the state of Washington, there were two that had both passed, would have conflicted with one another. One of the ballot measures would have made it illegal to expand background checks to gun shows, and the other required background checks for any purchase or transaction of a firearm. And as I understand it, that includes person-to-person sales. So if someone sells his next-door neighbor a firearm, as I understand it, and of course, the way it was explained to me, it could be wrong. I've not actually read the text of the measure. But the way it was explained to me is every transaction of a firearm would require a background check, which means that if someone buys a firearm for their son on his 18th birthday, that before giving the weapon to the son, there would have to be a background check. And to me, that just seems rather ludicrous. Now, again, I've not actually read the text of that measure, so maybe it was explained to me incorrectly. But anyway, back to the point about elections being silly ways to make decisions, especially when you're making decisions on policies that are going to, basically be in effect until a plurality of people decide that they don't want it to be in effect, but yet it applies to everyone. Seems rather strange, especially, and maybe I'm just coming at it from the standpoint of I don't want there to be these coercive governments that exist. And if you go back and listen to the interview that I did with Ben Stone, probably 45 or 50 episodes ago, it might have even been longer than that. And I actually told him, hopefully one day we will look back on history and think, wow, democracy really was a silly concept, and I'm glad it went away. But anyway, there were possibly some winners and losers on Tuesday from Tuesday's election. Some would argue that everyone that participated was a loser, while others would disagree and say that, no, only those that didn't wind up winning are the losers. Well, Reason.com has a list of what they are calling the best and the worst outcomes of the midterm elections. The best, quote, we threw the bums out. Now, I definitely don't agree with the title there because the bums are still in there. Sure, it's probably, in some cases, 15% of the bums are different bums than what were in there, but there's still bums that are in there. They go on to write, even the Republican stalwarts at Fox News agree that the GOP takeover of the Senate was a protest vote against President Obama and his failed policies, not an endorsement of Mitch McConnell and his party mates. It's always good to see politicians held accountable at the ballot box. Unfortunately, I don't really think that there's going to be anything really that changes with the Republicans. I would hope that the Republicans that now control the House and the Senate would act in some ways similar to the Republicans that controlled the House and the Senate when Bill Clinton was president, and not in the ways that they acted when George Bush was president. Because remember, the first 6 years of Bush, the size and scope and the power of the federal government grew and grew and grew. But when Bill Clinton was president and there was a Republican-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate, they claimed that there was a balanced budget, when in point of fact there wasn't. They just removed some of the things from the budget so that they could, make it look on paper like they had a balanced budget. But if you look at the actual debt, the national debt, that I remember when Clinton was in office and it hit this astronomical number of $4 trillion. Yeah, that debt that's now creeping up towards $18 trillion, that debt continued to rise every year that Bill Clinton was in the White House. But they told us that there was a surplus. Well, no, there wasn't. The next thing on Reason.com under the best, pot legalization. And I just want to gripe at Reason here for a second over the use of the term pot. I hate when people do that because it seems as though they're taking the term used by the opponents of cannabis legalization and using it for their own purposes, just like how President Obama has adopted the term Obamacare for the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, to where they're sort of saying, okay, we'll just claim the word to be ours and use it how we want. I still don't like it because it seems as though it's one of those terms that has a negative connotation. But cannabis legalization, there was some sort of victory for cannabis on Tuesday. Voters in Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. legalized recreational cannabis, dealing another blow to the war on drugs, although it's yet to be seen if the Republicans in the House of Representatives will wind up trying to stop the legalization effort there in Washington, D.C. A majority of voters in Florida backed a medicinal cannabis measure, but they fell short of the total vote, or rather fell short of the 60% vote total that was needed for approval. And another on the best, number 3, public sector unions lost big. I'll tell you about that, as well as the worst. And what is going on in Alabama? No, seriously, what is going on in Alabama? They voted on something that just boggles the mind. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. Now, before I continue with the article from Reason.com, I want to make sure that I tell you about the one of the several ways that you can wind up supporting the show indirectly. Now, there are ways that you can directly support the show, but indirectly, you can support the show by shopping online the way you normally do. You would just, instead of going directly to Amazon or some of the other affiliates that I have, start your shopping at shop.fppradio.com. From there, if you're looking for website hosting or to register a domain, you can click the link for Namecheap, and if you use the code Turkey Day anytime during the month of November, you will wind up getting 20% off shared hosting and special pricing on transfers or registration of popular top-level domains .com, .net, .org, .info, and .biz are the ones that you can wind up getting that 20% deal on. Again, coupon code Turkey Day. Start the shopping at shop.fppradio.com. Use the code Turkey Day for Namecheap. Now, I currently don't have a direct short URL for Namecheap. I will rectify that soon so that you can just go namecheap.fppradio.com. Don't try that right now because I don't have that set up, but I will get that set up before the end of today. But at shop.fppradio.com, there's more than just Namecheap. There's Amazon, there's Coinbase, there's ExpressCoin, and a couple others that I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's all there, shop.fppradio.com. So back to the article here from Reason.com. Some of the big winners, or actually what they have listed as the best and the worst outcomes of the midterm elections. Number 3 on the list of the 3 best, they have public sector unions lost big. Democrat Gina Raimondo became governor of Rhode Island despite being opposed by public sector unions for her central role in reining in out-of-control pension plans. Republican Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin and Rick Snyder in Michigan were re-elected despite taking on public sector unions. Now, just one thing real quick about Rhode Island. There's a story that I don't think I'll have time to get to today about one of the candidates in Rhode Island who received over 20% of the vote despite only having spent $35 on his entire campaign. Now, you may be asking yourself, how does somebody who only spent $35 on a gubernatorial campaign wind up getting over 20% of the vote? Well, there are a couple of reasons. Reason number 1 is that the Republican and Democratic candidate both suck, and that's true in most places, but not every third-party candidate, and in very few places does a third-party candidate wind up getting 20% of the vote. So what's the real reason? Well, the real reason is the candidate in Rhode Island who he's the nominee, or he was the nominee of the moderate party, Bob Healy. What caused Bob Healy to get over 20%? Well, he was in the debates. That's something that doesn't happen in most places. In most places, the candidates that aren't Republican and Democrat generally aren't in the debates. Bob Healy was in the debate with the Republican and Democratic Party nominees. People realized how bad the Republican and Democrats sucked, and they wound up voting for the moderate party candidate, Bob Healy. He got 22% of the vote, and the moderate party now gets ballot access in Rhode Island for a couple of years. So what were the worst things that happened on Tuesday, aside from the fact that, a bunch of politicians wound up getting elected and people lost liberties in some places. Well, according to Reason.com, number one on the list of the worst, minimum wage hikes. Voters in 4 states approved hikes in the minimum wage. Whatever the intentions might be, making workers more expensive by legislative fiat will make it much harder for the least skilled people to find jobs. And, well, yeah, there's not really anything to add to that. But if you want me to add to that, there's an excellent summary by, I forget who it was. It was one of I think a legislative candidate here in New Hampshire that was explaining this. And he said, if somebody has $5 an hour skills, but the minimum wage is $8 an hour, basically you're telling employers you have to overpay someone, or you're telling the $5 per hour skilled guy, hey, you know what? Nobody's going to hire you. And you wind up, truthfully, hurting the people that have the least amount of skill. Because it's one of those things. If you can't get experience without a job, you can't get a job without experience, and now you're mandating that all of the jobs be overpriced for what people are willing to pay their employees. Now, of course, the people that support raising the minimum wage are going to, trot out these studies and say, well, here's the states that raised a minimum wage last year, and here's the difference of employment in the final 5 months of the previous year and the first 5 months of the year after it went up, and see, the employment actually went up. But they're not being honest with you. If they wanted to be honest, they would show you the first 5 months of the previous year and then the first 5 months of the year after the employment went up, because in a lot of places there is seasonal employment where you have things such as construction and farm, to where people aren't really building houses in December. So the people that are in the construction field, they're going to be, laid off during the wintertime, and then they get rehired sometime in the spring, and that makes it appear, if you're only showing the last couple of months of one year and the first couple of months of the next, it's going to look like, hey, a bunch of people wound up getting hired. But they're not calculating the seasonal employment adjustments. So next on the worst, Berkeley, California passes a sin tax on soda. That's S-I-N tax, not S-Y-N, so it has nothing to do with how they speak about soda. They're calling soda a sin. The People's Republic of Berkeley overwhelmingly passed the country's first real sin tax on soda in the United States. The tax will increase the cost of a 20-ounce soda by 10%. That's not by 10 cents, that's by 10%. So in some places, I've seen a 20-ounce soda for $1.19, so that's going to be about a 12-cent hike on that 20-ounce. And number 3 on the worst, the GOP Senate is ready to spin. I'll tell you about that, as well as that weird, crazy, goofy thing that the people in Alabama are so afraid of. And it's not government. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. So, Reason.com has what they're calling the best and the worst from Election Day, November 4th, 2014. They're claiming that we threw the bums out, although I disagree. But they do say that the fact that the GOP took over the U.S. Senate, that was more of a protest against President Obama, Harry Reid, and some of the Democratic policies, and not so much an endorsement of Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. But still, the Republicans are going to see it as an endorsement of the Republicans. Number 2 on the best, cannabis legalization. which passed in Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, D.C., although the Republican-controlled House of Representatives may try to shoot down the will of the people in Washington, D.C. I've got a story that I'll try to get to today, not sure if I will. And also on the best, public sector unions lost big, and they cite the fact that a gubernatorial candidate in Rhode Island wound up winning, even though she was being opposed by public sector unions, and Governor Scott Walker and Governor Rick Snyder in Wisconsin and Michigan, respectively, were reelected despite taking on public sector unions. In the worst column, minimum wage hikes happened in 4 states. Berkeley, California, instituted a 10% tax on sodas, or it's kind of unclear how much of a tax, but it says that the average cost of a 20-ounce soda will increase by 10%. And number 3 on the worst, the GOP Senate is ready to spend. The bipartisan budget agreement reached late last year increased spending beyond the levels set by sequestration, and while many of the new Republican senators have been vague on what programs they would cut, they have all pledged to support defense spending and to, quote-unquote, protect and preserve Social Security and Medicare. That almost certainly means spending hikes over the next 2 years. So, from reason, they don't think that the Republicans are actually going to try to reduce spending, and I don't think that they will either, although I'm still holding out just a slight bit of hope that maybe the Republicans will act like they did when Bill Clinton was in office. And I don't mean that they'll go after Obama because, he's playing around with one of his interns. What I mean by act like they did when Bill Clinton was in office, remember we were told, Republicans are for small government. And they did some things when Bill Clinton was president that made it appear as though they actually did like small government. But then when George W. Bush, not his father, H.W., when George W. Bush became president, well, the small government thing just went completely out the window, and they're like, spend, 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 war, 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 enslave people, create more laws, blah, 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 and you know what happened. Now, what is going on in Alabama? I know I've asked the question a couple of times, but seriously, what is going on in Alabama? They had a couple of ballot measures on the ballot there, one of which I actually kind of like, and that is an expansion of gun ownership as a basic right, and not so much because I'm, some guy that loves guns. I just think that people have a right to defend themselves in any way that they see possible, whether that be with a stick, a pointy stick with a pointy rock on the end of it, or a gun. People have an inherent right to self-defense. And I believe that they can do that in a variety of ways. Guns are one of the modern weapons that allows people to do that. And that right was extended in Alabama, and it's now listed and protected as, one of the basic human rights. Actually, the constitutional change there makes it makes Article 1, Section 26 read, every citizen has a fundamental right to bear arms in defense of himself or herself and the state. Any restriction on the right shall be subject to strict scrutiny. Now, it doesn't say there can't be restrictions. It just says that any restriction will be subject to strict scrutiny. And I'm sure that the politicians in office, they'll certainly scrutinize themselves very strictly, because they do that every time they decide that they want to violate somebody's rights, right? That they're always very strict in how they scrutinize themselves. Oh, well, we just absolutely need to do this because fill in the blank, and then it's pretty much unquestioned. The other thing that this one has me scratching my head in Alabama, it was ballot amendment number 1. And the ballotpedia.org sort of summary says the amendment prevented Alabama courts from recognizing foreign and other laws that violate either Alabama's public policy or the rights of the state's citizens. It was primarily sponsored in the Alabama legislature by Senator Gerald Allen, where it was known as Senate Bill number 4. And then the text of what was on the ballot is kind of vague and says, shall the Constitution be amended to prohibit the state of Alabama from giving full faith and credit to public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of another state that violate the public policy of the state of Alabama, and to prohibit the application of foreign law in violation of rights guaranteed natural citizens by the United States and Alabama constitutions, statutes, law, and public policy thereof, without application to business entities. But then when you start reading the background of the bill, because when I read it, I was still confused. Like, what are they talking about? Like, obviously Canadian citizenship law isn't going to apply to somebody wanting to drive through Alabama. And I started wondering, what is going on in Alabama? Why are they passing this? What is the rationale? And when you get down to the background on ballotpedia.org, and I will post the link on the Facebook and my Twitter, it says during the 2011 state legislative session, Senator Gerald Allen proposed the Alabama Sharia Law Amendment, which did not make the November 2012 ballot. This measure sought to prohibit state courts from implementing Islamic Sharia law when making judicial decisions. Because there are so many people in Alabama that are Muslim to begin with. So, really, people in Alabama, this is where I'm from. I was born and raised in Alabama, and I know that they do some weird things down there, but this one just has me completely baffled. Are the people in Alabama and Oklahoma, because Oklahoma became the first state to attempt to prohibit Sharia law, and the Republican Party in New Hampshire adopted something at their state convention to say that, the Republican Party in New Hampshire stands against Sharia law. But are the people really that scared that, somebody might wind up practicing some sort of thing that is different than what they practice? And most people, what they know about Sharia law, they get from Fox News. But let me tell you, they're wrong. I had Will Coley on the show a good while back, and he explained Sharia law. Sharia law isn't coercive law. It is something similar to the Levitical law in the Bible or the Ten Commandments. It's something that people opt into. Stay tuned. There's more. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. And if you're tired of Facebook and other weird social media outlets that basically seem to be inundated with trolls, really, I guess, that's really the best way to describe them. The people that, they don't have meaningful interaction with you. They just sort of, every now and then they'll comment and sort of irritate you and agitate you and, poke you like you're a bear. If you're tired of that and you want to go to a social media outlet or social networking outlet to where you don't have to worry about the trolls, then join me over at liberty.me. You can use the referral code FPP Radio, and you get some kind of discount. I forget exactly what it is. I think it's $5 off per month. And then I also, wind up getting incentivized for having sent you over to the site. And one thing that is really nice about Liberty.me, because it is a paid site, is that you don't have to worry about the trolls, because there's not many trolls that are dedicated enough to want to pay something like $10 a month just so that they can do trollish things. That's why they stick to, Twitter and Facebook and Reddit, because those things are free. But Liberty.me, it's not just a social network. There's also publishing sites. There's free classes that are given by people such as Jeffrey Tucker, who is the genius behind Liberty.me. There are so many things there, it's difficult for me to summarize in a very short, concise manner. Just go there, Liberty.me, use referral code FPP Radio. So the thing in Alabama, I'm pretty much done talking about that, but it still baffles my mind that, voters in Alabama, 72.35% of them are so scared of Muslims that they wound up passing a bill, or actually a constitutional amendment, to prohibit Sharia law in the state. Although the wording of the bill didn't necessarily mention Sharia, but when you read the, how did this come about and wind up on my ballot? Then, you read it was the Protect Alabama from Sharia Law Act or something like that. Sharia Law and Prohibit was in the title. I just closed the window. But now let's talk about something that the Republicans might do to basically go against what the people, or at least a large number of people in Washington, D.C., wanted. The story here comes from the Associated Press. It says the national marijuana legalization debate is moving into the backyard of a Republican-controlled Congress now that the District of Columbia has voted to legalize growing, possessing, and sharing small amounts of cannabis. Voters in Oregon and Alaska also approved legislation. Sorry, had this weird sort of what do they call it? The dyslexic moment to where it looked like it said legislation, but it was approved legalization initiatives, joining Colorado and Washington state, where cannabis is already legally available. But while states out west enjoy both autonomy and distance from federal lawmakers have the power to quash any district law they don't like. And with legalization getting a foothold on the East Coast for the first time, the district's initiative could force Congress to make decisions affecting the future of legal cannabis nationwide. Ethan Nadelman, the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, said members of Congress are literally going to be eyewitnesses to these changes. The DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, has spent heavily to push all three ballot initiatives. Nadelman adds, it's a form of educating the members of Congress in a way that some members would not get educated depending on the states that they're from. All laws in the nation's capital are sent to Capitol Hill for review. Congress rarely invokes the power, but when members do, or rather, when members do want to block district policies, they can attach amendments to unrelated omnibus legislation too critical to be vetoed. Congress routinely bars the spending of local tax dollars on abortions for poor women using this strategy, and they delayed medical marijuana in the district for more than a decade. Voters in Washington, D.C. voted 69 to 31% on Tuesday to approve the growing, possessing, and sharing of up to 2 ounces of cannabis and up to 3 mature cannabis plants for personal use. Months earlier, a decriminalization law took effect, limiting the penalty for possession of a small amount, that which is considered for personal use, to a $25 ticket. But it could take months, at least, before the cannabis smoking is totally okay in D.C. Elected officials and advocates can't even agree whether the congressional review period lasts 30 days while the House and Senate are both in session, or 60. Yes, you heard that right. Elected officials and advocates of cannabis legalization aren't sure whether the review period that Congress has over new laws in D.C. lasts 30 days or 60 days while the House and Senate are both in session. Also, the initiative doesn't provide for the legal sale or taxation of cannabis. So, one thing that I really like about this is the fact that cannabis isn't going to be regulated in this, I almost said the state, in the District of Columbia, in Washington, D.C. It will not be similar to Colorado and Washington State, where there are heavy regulations and high taxes on cannabis. So basically, this is a step towards what I want of full legalization, meaning that there are no regulations, there are no sales taxes on it. People can buy, sell, trade, etc., without risk of going to jail, without risk of even getting a $25 ticket. That is what I support. And I wish that places like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, etc. would wind up doing something just like this, to where, okay, removes the criminal penalties and it's not taxed. But unfortunately, because in most places they want to wind up taxing things, they're not going to wind up introducing something like this. The article continues. It says, Democratic Mayor-elect Muriel Bowser said Wednesday that she will not let it take effect until the D.C. Council implements rules that she said could be similar on how we tax and regulate alcohol. For shame, Muriel Bowser. That is not what the people wanted. And you are just as bad as the Republicans in Congress by trying to shove something down their throats that they don't want. D.C. Cannabis Campaign Chairman Adam Eidinger vowed to challenge any delay, which he said could thwart the will of the voters for years. Colorado allowed home cultivation for more than a year before its first marijuana dispensary opened. He says 3 plants or less doesn't need to be taxed or regulated. They don't regulate people who brew their own beer. But yes, they do. As long as, if you're brewing under, a small enough amount, they don't regulate you. But if you brew over a certain amount, they most certainly will regulate that. The article here continues. It says the incoming mayor has no immediate power over the initiative, but once she takes office in January, she could introduce a bill that delays implementation until a regulatory scheme is enacted. Representative Andy Harris, a Maryland Republican, tried to block the decrim law and said on Wednesday that he'll try to block legalization as well, arguing that drug use among teenagers will rise if they fail to stop it. However, Representative Andy Harris, you are ignorant of facts. When you look at places such as Portugal and Uruguay, where they have removed all penalties for possession of pretty much every substance, you see that use goes down, abuse goes down, including teen use and teen abuse. So, Representative Andy Harris, you, sir, are just like most of the voters in Alabama. You know not what you protest. Stay tuned to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Hi, I'm Darryl W. Perry, and I need your help to take Peace, Love, Liberty Radio on the road. In the spirit of Motorhome Diaries and Liberty on Tour, I intend to take the message of peace, love, and liberty on the road. I intend to leave New Hampshire at the conclusion of the New Hampshire Liberty Forum and return at the beginning of PorcFest. During the 104-day trip, I'll be visiting at least 10 cities across the country, speaking to people about the ideas of peace, love, and liberty, while continuing to produce daily Liberty media. Pensacola, Florida, Austin, Texas, Sedona, Arizona, and Denver, Colorado are already on the map. If you have a college group, a local Liberty on the Rocks, or other Liberty meetup that you'd like me to visit, you can possibly add your event to my calendar. To find out more about the tour or to donate, visit tour.fppradio.com. That's tour.fppradio.com. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, online at fppradio.com. Now, I promise the big announcement is coming up. I'll get to that probably at the end of this segment, possibly the beginning of the next. But something else that I totally even forgot to mention, this is episode 100 of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio, and I figured that episode 100 is the perfect time for a big announcement and a change to the show. So stay tuned, and I'll tell you more about that. But let me get back to the story that I was talking about last hour, towards the end of the first hour, about the cannabis legalization in Washington, D.C., and what some of the Republicans are trying to do. And, of course, you know, this isn't me blaming the Republicans, because I think that Democrats are equally as bad, especially the mayor-elect Democrat Muriel Bowser, who said that she would not let the cannabis legalization in Washington, D.C. go into effect until, quote, she could have, she could be similar to how we tax and regulate alcohol. She wants to implement rules to do so there in D.C., despite the fact that 69% of voters in D.C. said that they just wanted it to be legal. Like, you know, no penalties at all for up to 2 ounces of cannabis. There's more to that article. It says, but polls have shown a majority, and this, of course, after the statement about the Republicans in Congress wanting to do away or overturn the will of the voters there in D.C. And generally, I will not talk about the will of the voters, because generally the will of the voters violates people's rights. But in this case, the voters in Washington, D.C., they were actually, you know, reducing government power and expanding the rights of people in D.C. So I will recognize the will of the voter when it does not interfere with another person's rights. Polls have shown a majority of Americans favor legalization of cannabis, and Republicans are far from united in opposition. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, the ranking Republican on the subcommittee that oversees the district, said Tuesday that the city's cannabis laws should be left to local officials. He has also sought to block he sought to block the federal government from interfering with states' medical marijuana programs. However, Senator Rand Paul has not introduced legislation to remove federal prohibitions on cannabis. He has introduced some legislation regarding industrial hemp, but not all-out legalization or federal decrim of cannabis. Those laws are still on the books. Cannabis at the federal level is still on the Schedule 1 of controlled substances. No thanks to Rand Paul. The article continues. It says, if the Republican-led Congress does try to quash the initiative by amending some bill President Obama will not veto, it could force him to antagonize his base after advocates pointed to the huge racial disparities in cannabis arrest in the nation's capital. In Florida, 58% of voters voted for legalization of medical marijuana on Tuesday, narrowly missing the 60% needed to amend the state's constitution. Trial attorney John Morgan, who vowed Wednesday to begin working on another try in 2016, said, "This is just the first battle. I plan to win the war." Hopefully, Mr. Morgan, you are correct, and you do win the war there in Florida. And hopefully the peoples in other states where they actually have the option of initiative and referendum, hopefully they're able to wind up having major victories in 2016. I will certainly be cheerleading those efforts and doing what I can to help. The article from the AP concludes, other legislation, or rather legalization advocates, plan a big push for similar initiatives on the 2016 ballots in California, Arizona, Maine, Massachusetts, Nevada, that according to the Drug Policy Alliance. Legalization opponent Ken Sabat, the president of the Smart Approaches to Marijuana, says his side would need to respond in kind. Tuesday's votes were, quote, a bit of a wake-up call before 2016, he said, noting that legalization advocates had vastly outspent opponents this time. Well, there was one other victory on Tuesday, and it's something that I'm surprised Reason did not mention. It was a victory against the expansion of what is called Top 2, where they introduced this and implemented this in California and Washington a few years ago. It was passed in 2010 in California, I believe in 2012 in Washington. I could be off on the date for Washington. But what Top 2 does is it winds up giving you what they call a blanket primary, to where all candidates that file and have the appropriate number of signatures to get on the primary ballot are on the primary ballot. So you've got Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Greens. In California, they've got the Peace and Freedom Party, the Socialist Workers Party, and several others. In Washington, they don't actually have official party names on the ballot. They allow the candidates to say prefer blank party, and then they can fill in the blank with whatever they want. So, for instance, someone in Washington state could say prefers none of the above party, and it would have on the ballot prefers none of the above party. You could also put prefers vote here party, and then it would say prefers vote here party. Now, of course, there is a limit on the number of characters in the name. There's also a limit that you can't say, like, prefers Republican Democrat. So you can't have, like, two names of two parties. But it's still the same, to where everybody is on a blanket primary, and then only the top 2 vote getters are on the general election ballot, which for some people, that doesn't really change what their ballot would look like, because ballot access is so severe that you don't really have any choice other than a Republican or a Democrat. But in California and in Washington, it winds up having the effect of, in some districts, you actually wind up with a general election ballot with 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats. Every now and then, you'll have a race in which a Democrat doesn't file or a Republican doesn't file, and there might be 1 or 2 races to where a minor party candidate actually winds up being on the general election ballot, and that's only because one of the major parties just didn't run anybody. So it vastly limits choice, and the supporters of Top 2 have been trying to basically expand this across the country. It was defeated in Arizona a couple of years ago, and it was defeated on Tuesday in Oregon. The AP, they have sort of a rundown of some of these ballot initiatives. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all of them, but minimum wage, which I did mention earlier, that was increased in Arkansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Alaska. The what is being called a food fight. Voters in Colorado and Oregon rejected measures that would require labeling of certain genetically modified foods. The proposals would have applied to raw and packaged foods produced entirely or partially by genetic engineering. They did not apply to food served in restaurants. In Hawaii, voters in Maui County opted to temporarily ban the cultivation of genetically engineered crops after a campaign featuring $8 million in advertising from some of the world's largest corn seed producers. Funny that it's corn producers that were backing this, because corn, for those who don't know, corn is actually one of the most genetically modified crops in the world. So stay tuned to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. When we come back, the big announcement. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. So I inadvertently lied. I did not make the big announcement during the last segment, but I'll go ahead and I'll make the big announcement right now before Derrick J joins the show. Technically, he's already joined because he's physically in a chair in the studio.
Hey!
And he just said a word, so he joined. But before we get anything else out of Derrick J, I want to tell you the big announcement with the show. And Derrick, you recently had some changes with your show as well. And this is episode 100 of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. And, you know, it's one of those things to where, you know, it's a nice round number, and it's always good to make a change when there's a nice round number involved. That way, you know, I don't know, it just sort of feels complete. So this is actually going to be the final live show, but it is not the final episode of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. The show's just not going to be a 2-hour live show on Sundays anymore. It will, however, become a 30-minute show that happens several times a week. So to start, I'm going to, you know, I think I'm going to start at 3 days, and then from there expand probably to 5 days per week. So it's going to be a live, it's going to be recorded live, if that makes sense. So there's not going to be the post-production of edit out if I, you know, goof up and mispronounce a word. So it's going to be a 30-minute recorded live show, and I plan on having the show up every day that I do the show by about 3 o'clock. So by mid-afternoon, you should be able to go to fppradio.com, and the latest episode of Peace, Love, Liberty Radio will be there. And it's going to allow me to do a couple of things. One, it's going to allow me to be a little fresher instead of, you know, holding on to some news until a Sunday and then telling you about stuff that you've already probably heard about. So it allows me to be fresher. It allows me to actually wind up putting out more content to where I could theoretically do a, you know, 4 or 5 day a week thing, 30 minutes each time, and that winds up being a little more than what I'm doing now after you factor in that, you know, I've got commercials. So when this show is done, it's 118 minutes without commercials. So that's, you know, what, that's just under 4 30-minute shows. So if I do 4 shows a week, then I'm still putting out more content. So, you know, don't think, you know, like Daryl's gone soft or Daryl's gotten lazy. Daryl's still doing a 7-day-a-week newscast, and Daryl's going to start doing a several-time-a-week 30-minute podcast. I'm just not going to do this live show on Sundays, and today's the last live show. Derrick J joins the show, and
Holla.
You had a big change with your show, Peace News Now.
Changes. It's a good day.
So what was that change, and will people hear you following this show today?
Yes, they will hear a repeat of an episode of Peace News, but I believe it will be the final one. I don't think that typically Sunday from 5 to 7 will be Peace News anymore. It has been since the very beginning. And I'm excited to announce...
And the very beginning was how long ago?
November of 2012 is when Peace News started, but it wasn't a live podcast at that time. I think it went live as a podcast after a year of being a pre-recorded, video-produced thing. So that was in, like, June of 2013. So it's been, I guess, a little over a year and a half of doing live shows, and it's been a lot of fun. Fortunately, though, my time slot has recently moved, and so I'll be broadcasting Peace News from 10 to midnight Eastern Time, Tuesday and Thursday nights. So it's a lot easier to explain. It's a lot easier to give out that show time, 10 to midnight, Tuesday and Thursday, instead of saying, all of these confusing different days of the week and different times.
Sunday at this time, Tuesday at this time.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems that the Freedom Feens has, is because they do this weird split shift sort of thing, and you're one of the co-hosts of Freedom Feens.
Yeah, in fact, I'll be hosting tonight. Every Sunday from 1 to 3 a.m. Eastern, I host Freedom Feens, which is like, I think it's one of the best shows on radio, and of course I'm biased because I'm on the show, but also it's unlike any other program in that it contains a roundtable host of different ragtag anarchist types, but they're like philosophical anarchists who are going to break it down and soothe you with liberty.
And let me see if I can recall the thing that Michael Dean says must be said at least once an hour. Obama's a liar, a socialist, and his feet stink.
He has stinky feet, yep.
Did I get that right, or did I miss something?
Yeah, I think that's important to get the conservatives on board, because there's a lot of like Republican, conservative type people out there who, they're not crazy, but their politicians are. The
right.
People who run their political parties are, the people who want political power are. And I just feel like those conservatives out there, they're listening to talk radio. They're looking for a voice, someone to speak for them. And I think those people could be anarchists, and they have been for the last little while. So that's why Freedom Feens is such an important show, because it reaches out to the conservative talk radio listeners who otherwise would be like banging their heads against the wall saying, why don't the Democrats get it and the Republicans don't get it either? Rush Limbaugh and all these Mark Levin-type talk show people are screaming in my ear like neocons chanting for more war. When are they going to get it that we got to have fiscal responsibility and socially be socially liberal? So
right, and that's the funny thing, is because Republicans claim, we need to be fiscally responsible.
Yeah.
But yet they want to expand war, and now they're saying that, since the Republicans are going to wind up controlling the House and the Senate, that, the 1,500 troops that Obama wants to send over to Iraq, that's nothing. You think that's a lot of troops? You just wait until we're in charge.
Yeah. So since the conservatives pretty much get the fiscal issues and are for limited government, with the exception of war, of course, I think the focus for me when I host Freedom Feens is really about bringing around the social issues to the conservatives, because I'm gay and I like cannabis, and so I feel like I can make the case for these conservatives that, hey, I want total freedom for you. Now, can you do the same for me?
No. No, they can't. So, just real quick, what are your thoughts on Sharia law?
I don't know anything about it.
Okay, so I'll explain a little bit in the next segment, but the people in Alabama, I've been looking over voting results, and there was a ballot constitutional amendment in Alabama to where they prohibited Sharia law. And I wasn't sure if you knew much about this. So we'll discuss Sharia a little bit when we come back on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. The final live edition, but not the final show, online at fppradio.com. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. online at fppradio.com. Before I get back into the topic du jour, I want to make sure that I tell you about Roberts and Roberts Brokerage. Since 1977, Roberts and Roberts Brokerage has been a trusted source for buying and selling your investment-grade precious metals. They now take Bitcoin for purchasing precious metals so that you can turn your profits into a long-term, stable investment. Call Roberts and Roberts today. Well, not today because it's Sunday if you're listening live, but if you're not listening live, give them a call. 800-874-9760. They will give you some knowledgeable advice on investing and help you buy some gold and or silver. Again, 800-874-9760. And the price of Bitcoin has been, increasing a little bit today. It had been hovering for a few days down around 340. It's up around 358 per Bitcoin right now. Hopefully, we wind up seeing the magical 1,000 number again, which we saw for the first time about a year ago, I believe. Derrick J back in studio looking as dashing as always.
Aww.
So, Derek, I was able to find an article from Huffington Post that explains what Sharia is.
Okay.
And hopefully, I will not only enlighten you, but also the people listening that might think, oh, Sharia is that thing that Muslims do where they cut your head off, because that's what Fox News told me.
Now, why should we take HuffPo's word for what Sharia law is?
Well, because they actually had some Muslim scholars that they talked to that gave them these answers.
Fair enough.
Sharia is an Arabic word that literally means the path to be followed, and also commonly refers to a path to water. The term is broad, encompassing both a personal moral code and religious law. There are two sources of Sharia: the Quran, which many Muslims consider to be the literal word of God, and the Sunnah, the divinely guided translation, or rather the divinely guided traditions of Islam's prophet Muhammad. The interpretation of Sharia is called fiqh. I know I'm not pronouncing that right. It's Fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. Because that is man-made, it can be changed. Sharia for many Muslims is divine and cannot be changed. So what does Sharia cover? Because, just explaining what the word means doesn't really explain what Sharia is. While often thought of as a legal system, Sharia covers personal and collective spheres of daily life and has three components: belief, character, and action. Only a small portion of the action component relates to law. In fact, only about 80 of the Quran's 6,236 verses are about specific legal injunctions.
Yeah, but don't they have certain things that could be made into laws? Like, I know from the Bible there's like, oh, don't bring your donkey to the well on Tuesdays and don't eat shellfish. Couldn't they just, those aren't specifically about laws, but couldn't they convert them into laws?
Right, and that is kind of the point that they're getting at here, and the point that I'm trying to make is, just because something is considered to be, the path for certain people of certain religions, doesn't mean that those people are trying to enforce that at the barrel of a gun.
Right.
Because there are a lot of people that call themselves Christians that might protest you, Derek, because, you're one of them queerosexuals.
Uh-huh.
But yet they will not protest Red Lobster for serving shellfish.
Yeah, isn't that a bit hypocritical? Because it's in the same passage where
it's just a few verses
forbidden
apart from one another.
Yeah.
They won't go protest, LL Bean for selling fabric that has, mixed cotton and something else, because that's also a prohibition in Leviticus.
Yeah.
So
polyester is a crime. however.
Right, but, like a 50-50 cotton wool blend.
Yeah.
Like, nobody should be stoned to death for wearing cotton wool blend.
I agree with that.
Nobody should be stoned for wearing polyester.
Everybody should be stoned. You're talking about...
Well, when you say stoned, you're talking about, like...
cannabis.
Pass the doochie to the right-hand side.
Which, if you're a religious person, you would have to believe that God gave us, right?
Right. Because the Bible says God created the plants. It doesn't say that God created the plants and they were good, except for that cannabis
Except
plant.
Don't use cannabis.
There are only 2 plants
really
mentioned in the Bible that were prohibited.
What are they?
Eating of the tree of life,
right,
and the tree of knowledge.
Aren't they the same thing?
Those were 2 different trees.
Oh, okay.
The
tree of knowledge of good and evil is the one with the apple, right?
Okay. And technically, it wasn't even an apple. People just started at some point saying that it was an apple.
Was it just a fruit?
Some kind of fruit that
it's a knowledge fruit.
We don't know because that tree, it's not around anymore.
Right.
So we don't know what it was. But, again, it doesn't say, and also don't smoke cannabis, or don't eat cannabis, or don't eat poison ivy. Like, that would be a good thing to write down. Like, hey, here's this plant that, it's poisonous if you touch it. But that's not written down.
If only. So Sharia law says nothing about this stuff either? Says nothing about plants? What plants you can have and what you can't?
There is a diet in the Quran that's very similar to
no pork.
The diet that people that are Jewish follow, to where they will not eat bacon, they will not eat Jell-O is technically a pork product.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's this thing called Sharia law, and mainstream media makes it sound really scary by putting weird infographics up on the screen of ththings in flames, and it's not that scary. What it sounds like you're saying is it's a lot like Jewish law, where it's like, we have a bris in the first 8 days, and we culturally eat a lot of pastrami on rye, and we don't eat pig, and of course, we don't mix dishes. There's just like these cultural rules, right?
There are some countries that they base their laws on Sharia, just as there are countries that base their laws on what's called Judeo-Christian values.
Right.
So to blame everything bad that happens in one of these quote-unquote Muslim countries on Sharia, to be, morally or even philosophically consistent, you would have to blame dropping bombs on people. Blame that on Judeo-Christian values, because we're told that the U.S. and UK and all these other countries that are dropping bombs around the world, that, those are Christian nations.
Who would Jesus bomb?
I think Jesus would not bomb anybody.
Well, you're wrong, because obviously the U.S. is a Christian nation, and it would bomb Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and everywhere else that might cause a problem.
Yeah, well, that's the lie that we're told, is that the U.S. is a Christian nation. And it depends on how you define the term.
Right.
Because there are, I think the last study I saw, somewhere around like 60-some-odd% of people in the U.S. do nominally claim to be Christian.
Yes.
But how many of those people actually are?
Well, how many people dropping the bombs are Christians? I think probably a majority, right? The majority of the people in the military are Christian.
Yeah, I remember when I used to, go to an organized church, that they would have, we've got Veterans Day coming up. So the Sunday near Veterans Day, they would always say, would all of the veterans please stand so we can thank you? And then we would sing, Onward Christian Soldiers.
Shouldn't everybody be getting on their knees to thank the soldiers?
No, they should not. And we'll have more when we come back, including why you should not thank the soldiers on Veterans Day. That's sure to, bring a smile to people's faces here on Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Welcome back to Peace, Love, Liberty Radio. Online at fppradio.com. So, I told you that we would tell you why you should not thank a veteran this upcoming Veterans Day. But I figure instead of, a couple of people that never served in the military explaining to you why you should not thank a veteran, how about somebody that actually did serve in the military?
What do you mean serve?
Like you go in and you become a slave because you signed a little contract that says, I'll be your, whatever for the next 4 years of my life.
We need a new term for that. Because service is not it.
Well, I consider that serving the same way that, doing any kind of job. Like, I served in an airline for 4 years. I did a service. I got a paycheck.
Yeah. Mercenary work is what it is. And
yeah,
it's different.
I was never a mercenary. I almost became a mercenary, but then became a conscientious objector before going to boot camp. So people that actually went into the military and then later, became conscientious objectors say that I'm not a real conscientious objector because I never went to boot camp.
Okay. Well, I just have a problem with continuing the terminology of calling military people like servicemen and insinuating that they serve people. I guess they're serving
good
someone.
Service.
Yeah,
but
right.
It
implies service is a word that just implies something good, like, oh, thanks for the service.
Yeah, I could see how it could be construed that way, but that's certainly not what is in my mind when I use the term.
All right, maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just a weird hang-up about it.
There's an article from Salon.com written by somebody that actually was in the military, Rory Fanning, who originally wrote this article at TomDispatch.com. It was republished by Salon.
Cool.
And it's about a week and a half old. So it begins last week in a quiet indie bookstore on the north side of Chicago. I saw the latest issue of Rolling Stone resting on a chrome-colored plastic table a few feet from a barista brewing a vanilla latte. A cold October rain fell outside. A friend of mine grabbed the issue and began flipping through it. Knowing that I was a veteran, he said, "Hey, did you see this?" Pointing to a news story that seemed more like an ad, it read in part, "This Veterans Day, Bruce Springsteen, Eminem, Rihanna, Dave Grohl, and Metallica will be among numerous artists who will head to the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on November 11th for the Concert for Valor, an all-star event that will pay tribute to armed services."
Valor.
Concert for Valor. That sounds like something the North Korean government would organize, I said as I typed concertforvalor.com into my MacBook Pro, looking for more information. The sucking sound from the espresso maker was drowning out a 10-year-old Shins song. As I read, my heart sank, my shoulders slumped. Special guests at the Concert for Valor were to include Meryl Streep, Tom Hanks, and Steven Spielberg. The mission of the concert, according to a press release, was to raise awareness of veterans issues and provide a national stage for ensuring that veterans and their families know that their fellow Americans' gratitude is genuine.
Boy, wow, what a lofty goal. Raise awareness of veterans issues and what? Let the people know that we care about them, basically?
Yeah,
wow, that's heartwarming.
That their fellow Americans' gratitude is genuine.
Yeah, my gratitude is genuine. It's not fake gratitude when I say thank you for your service.
Well, some people do that just because they feel that, that's what they're supposed to do. Like saying,
it's
God
very
bless you after somebody sneezes.
No, it's very genuine.
So the article,
this concert will prove it.
I'm going to skip down a little bit. He says, though I couldn't quite say why, that Concert for Valor ad felt tired and sad, despite the images of Rihanna singing full-throated into a golden microphone and James Hetfield and Kirk Hammett of Metallica wailing away on their guitars. I had gotten my own share of thanks from civilians when I was still a U.S. Army Ranger. Who hadn't? It had been the endless theme of the post 9/11 era, how thankful other Americans were for what we would do. Well, what exactly for them? And here it was again. I couldn't help wondering, would veterans somewhere actually feel the gratitude that Starbucks and HBO hoped to convey? I went home and cooked dinner for my wife and little girl in a semi-depressed state, thinking about the word valor, which was to be at the heart of the event, and wondering about the Hall of Fame lineup of 21st century liberalism that wasn't promoting it, or rather that was promoting it, or planning to turn out to hell it. Rolling Stone, the magazine of Hunter S. Thompson, and all things rock and roll. Bruce Springsteen, the billion-dollar working-class hero. Eminem, the white rapper who has sold more records than Elvis. Metallica, the crew who sued Napster and metal bands of choice for so many long-haired disenfranchised youth of the 80s and 90s. They were all going to say thank you again. Later that night, I sat down and Googled vets honored. Dozens and dozens of stories promptly queued up on my screen. Try it for yourself sometime. One of the first items I clicked on was the 50th anniversary celebration in Bangor, Maine, of the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Whoa.
The alleged Pearl Harbor of the Vietnam War. Governor Paul LePage had spoken ringingly of the veterans of that war. These men were just asked to go to a foreign land and protect our freedoms, and they weren't treated with respect when they returned home. Now it's time to acknowledge it. Vietnam, he insisted, was all about protecting freedom. Such a simple and innocent explanation for such a long and horrific war. Lest you forget, the governor and those gathered in Bangor that day were celebrating a still murky incident that touched off a massive American escalation of the war. It was claimed that North Vietnamese patrol boats had twice attacked an American destroyer, though President LBJ later suggested that the incident might have even involved shooting a flying fish or at whales. As for protecting freedom in Vietnam, tell the dead Vietnamese in America's free fire zones about that. No one, however, cared about such details. The point was that eternal thank you. If only, I thought, some inquisitive and valorous local reporter had asked the governor, treated with disrespect by whom, and pointed to the mythology behind the idea that American civilians had mistreated GIs returning from Vietnam.
But isn't that true? That's not mythology.
Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the Veterans Administration, which denied returning soldiers proper health care, or the VFW and the American Legion, organizations that weren't eager to claim the country's defeated veterans of a disastrous war as their own. When it came to thanks and awareness raising, no American war with a still living veteran seemed too distant to be ignored. Google told me, for example, that Upper Gwynedd, Pennsylvania, a town that I've never heard of, had recently celebrated its 12th annual Multicultural Day by thanking its forgotten Korean War veterans, according to a local newspaper report. Included in the festivities were martial arts demonstrations and traditional Korean folk dancing. Let me skip down again. While Googling around, I noticed an Allied story about President Obama christening a poetic-sounding American Veterans Disabled for Life Memorial on October 5th. There, he wisely noted that the U.S. should never rush into war. As he spoke, however, the Air Force, the Navy, and Special Forces, as well as the headquarters of the Big Red One, the Army's 1st Infantry Division, were already involved in the latest war he personally ordered in Iraq and Syria, while, of course, bypassing Congress. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Damn, I voted for Obama because he said he'd end our overseas wars. At least it's not Bush sending planes, drones, missiles, and troops back there, because if it were, I'd actually be mad. And he goes on. It's a fairly lengthy article, but you're beginning to see the point to where, thanking people in the military for their service, it's really sad and tired, and it's used as basically political bait, if you will, to where people throw it out. See how much I care about the veterans? Vote for me! and yet they turn around and they still send them to go die and kill people.
Thanks for your service, Darryl.
You do a much better service than what most of the people in the military have done, because you've never killed anybody and claimed that it was for my freedom. So thank you, Derrick J, for not killing people and lying to me and saying that it's for my freedom. Find me again sometime.